just found it. Well, hello, everyone. I would like to officially welcome you to our forum and call the meeting to order now. I'm Connie Nestor Anderson. Sorry, that was a slip there. And sometimes I forget I got married. I do that a lot, actually. Um, anyway, I want to wish you all a hearty welcome to the Scottish American History Forum. And I think, as most of you know, the History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots, formerly the Illinois St. Andrews Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the whole state of Illinois way back in 1845. It was later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, and it's located in North Riverside, Illinois. Now, Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of our Scottish culture, in addition to support of the Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care Campus. For additional information, please just check our website, www.chicagoscots.org. And please, please, please give generously to our Caledonia Senior Care Charity. It is a one-of-a-kind mission that all Scots can be proud of. Before we begin our presentation today with question-answer period afterwards, with our very dear friend, Catherine Fort, who participates nearly every single month with our forum, I might add, and thank you, Catherine. I would like to remind you that next month, on August 8th, Dr. Alistair Mann, history professor emeritus from the University of Stirling, will be returning to us to discuss pre-modern Parliament of Scotland through its institutional and sonic history. So we're all dying to know what that's all about, and I do hope you'll all make time to join us because it's certainly bound to be an interesting topic. Now today, Gus Noble, our president, will be unable to join us because he's in Scotland with his wee two sons, and they're having a holiday. But Gus asked me to bid you all fond greetings and to invite all of you to attend our annual Chicago Scots picnic, which is going to be held at our Caledonia Senior Care Campus on August 1st. And we'll have live entertainment, lots of tasty Scottish cuisine, dancing and pipers and lots of good fun. So if you can get up here, please do. It's free. And also, please, I want to remind you to register for our annual Kilted Classic Golf Tournament. And Dawn, I'm planning to sponsor a foursome this time, so we'll be in touch. But it's planned for September 24th at Cantigny here in the Chicago area. And of course, it's a good cause because we raise funds for Caledonia Senior Care. So that's coming right up. So we hope you'll all get up here. Jim, if you're back from Scotland, you should be all practiced up. So you should get up here. And actually, all of you. So now I think, Catherine, if you're ready, it's probably time to move forward with our presentation today. We are so very pleased to have Catherine Fort. Catherine is president of the Scottish Society of Wilmington, North Carolina, which was established to celebrate Scottish culture and heritage in North Carolina's historic Cape Fear region. And Catherine is here today to speak to us on the bards of the Highlands and the Macquaries of the Lowlands. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. But Catherine, thanks for joining today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just going to mute everybody. And
yeah, well, I'll help.
Okay. Okay. I hope. Oh, Connie, I'm sorry. I muted you.
You are Johnny on the spot. I'll help you mute and turn off cameras.
Okay.
And at the end of Catherine's presentation, we'll ask all of you to unmute and we'll get your cameras back on. And we'll have a nice participatory question, answer, and discussion. So Catherine, take it away.
Okay. All right. Matin va agus falcha huladunya. That's Gaelic for good morning and welcome, everyone. If you registered based on the title alone, bards, Macaris, and not much else, you're in the right room, but as you may have guessed, excuse me, I'm sorry, got a little congestion from this past weekend. You may have guessed from this title slide. I will tell you up front that we're going to wander well past the poetry before we're done. But stay with me because it comes back around. I'm delighted to be with you today. A
Slide.
room. I'm sorry, you're not seeing the slide?
No, I say that's a gorgeous slide.
Oh,
Right
thank
there.
you. I will freely admit that they were created by AI. I'm not a graphic designer. Okay, I'm delighted to be with you today, a room that actually knows this history, which means I get to skip the parts that I usually have to explain and go straight to the parts that matter. And I want to take this moment to particularly acknowledge the work of Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, caring for for elders living with Alzheimer's and other forms of memory loss. My own mother lived with Alzheimer's, and I don't think it's a coincidence that an organization built around preserving Scottish memory also spends its resources caring for people who are losing theirs. So before I say anything else this morning, thank you for that work. It means something to me personally, and it isn't lost on me that I'm about to spend an hour talking about a whole culture's habit of memory. I'm also going to say plainly up front, since I know this room includes people who've spent careers on this material, I'm not a professional historian and I don't pretend to be one. I call myself a Scottish heritage storyteller. And I mean that as a real distinction, not as false modesty. My job today isn't to break new scholarly ground. It's to take the record that historians have carefully built and hand it to you as something lived, as story, not just citation. Where the scholarship is genuinely contested, and there's a stretch later on where it is, I'll tell you that plainly, rather than smooth it over for the sake of a tidier narrative. You may see a little bit of my sash, my tartan sash on my collar, on my shoulder here. Given that I'm a descendant from at least 7 clans or families, people often ask me why I chose Forbes as my primary tartan. It's got a long story behind it, but I'll just give you the beginning of it. It starts in 1650 at the Battle of Dunbar. My 7th great-grandfather, Daniel Forbes, was there on the losing side. He was captured, forced to march south in what's remembered as the Durham Death March, and held prisoner in Durham Cathedral. And then he was put on a ship, not by choice, as a prisoner of war, sent to Massachusetts as an indentured servant. Somehow he survived. He fulfilled his indenture, married a woman from Concord named Deborah Rediat, and he became a landowner, which is no small thing because he'd been a landowner in Scotland too before Dunbar took it from him. He didn't just survive the crossing. He rebuilt piece by piece, more or less the exact life that had been taken from him on the other side of an ocean, starting from nothing but his own name. And 10 generations later, I'm standing here because he did. I should say how I know all of this because it matters for a talk about memory. I didn't dig this up myself, not originally. There were genealogists on both sides of my family, generations back, who did the patient work of writing this down long before I was born. What I have done since is confirm it. There's documentary proof behind the dates I just gave you, not just family story. But the family story came first. Someone cared enough to keep it decades before anyone thought to prove it. So when I wear this tartan, it isn't decoration. It's a way of honoring not just where we came from, but what it took to get here. And that's really what this talk is all about. Not just history, memory, specifically a habit of memory, the very particular Scottish instinct for keeping the past alive in verse, in song, in story, and what that habit did once it crossed an ocean and landed in the middle of a revolution. Here's where we're headed. We'll start with the Bards and the Macquaries and Robert Burns, who I think is the culmination of both traditions. We'll ask an honest, open question about whether that same habit of memory helped shape the Scottish Enlightenment and, through it, the American founding. We'll cross the Atlantic with three different waves of Scots and follow their ballads, their tales, and their hymns into the sandhills of North Carolina and the Appalachian backcountry beyond. We'll watch that same community split itself in half at Moores Creek and Kings Mountain. And then we'll spend our last 20 minutes or so on the part I find most exciting, proof that none of this has stopped. We're still telling these stories through a novelist, through a battlefield anniversary, through a Highland Games field, and through a few thousand very loud Scots who showed up in Boston and Miami this summer on a different kind of journey. So let's begin where that habit actually started, not with kings and not with battles, but with the people whose whole job was remembering out loud. Scotland had two parallel traditions of professional remembering. I'm sorry, did you see the slide change?
We did. Thank
Okay, excellent, thank you. Scotland had two parallel traditions of professional remembering. In the Highlands, the bards, attached to a clan rather than a crown, keeping genealogy, praise, and grievance alive across generations who couldn't read. That word most of you already know. In the lowlands, the Macquaries, court poets like William Dunbar and Robert Henryson, did much the same job in a different dialect. And that word tends to be less familiar even to people who know Scotland well. It's worth pausing on because it's a good word. Makar is just the Scots word for maker, used specifically for a poet, the same instinct behind the Greek word poet itself, which also means one who makes. A Makar's job wasn't just to entertain a king, but to chronicle him in verse as a kind of civic record. Different courts, different languages, same underlying function. Poetry in Scotland was never purely private art. It was civic memory composed to be spoken aloud, because verse is what survives being spoken aloud generation after generation in a society where not everyone could read. Let me show you how seriously that function was taken with a harder case than a nice court poem. After Culloden in 1746, the government didn't just break the clan system politically. It moved against Highland dress specifically, restricting tartan and traditional Highland clothing for decades. Some of what gets repeated about that crackdown has grown in the telling. You'll sometimes hear that Gaelic itself was outlawed, or that the bagpipe was formally classified as an instrument of war. The documentary evidence for both of those specific claims is thinner than the popular version suggests, and I'd rather flag that than repeat it as settled fact. What is well documented is that the political and clan leadership of Jacobite Scotland was broken by design, deliberately and thoroughly. So the cause was dead. But decades later, it came back, not as an army, as a song catalog. Songwriters in the late 1700s and early 1800s, a full generation or more after Culloden, wrote what we now call Jacobite songs, laments, tributes, coded expressions of loyalty to a cause with no realistic hope of returning. These songs weren't really about restoring a Stuart king anymore. They were about keeping alive the idea that Scotland had once resisted, that defeat wasn't the same as forgetting. Scholars who study this material describe it precisely. The songs turned a specific failed dynastic rebellion into something more durable, a symbol of Scottish distinctiveness itself. That's what a poetic tradition can do that a history book can't. A history book records that a cause lost. A song keeps the cause emotionally alive for people who were never going to fight for it 100 years and an ocean away. So here's the question underneath all of this, and I think it's the real center of this talk. What happens when a people lose their homeland through defeat, through eviction, through a forced or desperate crossing of an ocean they'll never recross? The answer Scotland gives over and over across 400 years is the same answer. They put it in a song. Not because song is sentimental, but because song is portable. It needs no ship's hold, no property, no permission from a landlord or a king. It survives exactly as long as someone keeps singing it. One poet took that whole inheritance, the bard's oral craft and the macar's literary one, the Highland grievance and the lowland wit, and did something with it that neither tradition had quite managed alone. Let's talk about him. Robert Burns is, in my opinion, the culmination of both traditions at once. Not just a great lowland poet, but the point where the bard's oral inheritance and the macar's literary one fuse into a single voice. And he didn't only write new poems. He spent years working alongside song collectors, tracking down old traditional tunes and half-remembered oral verses that were on the edge of disappearing, and reworking them into the versions we still sing today. Auld Lang Syne is the most famous example, built on an older traditional tune rather than an invented whole. That's bardic work in the oldest sense, rescuing a memory that was about to be lost. And he did it while writing deliberately in Scots, the language of ordinary farm laborers, not the polished English of the literary establishment, at a moment when Scots was steadily losing ground to English as the language of print and education. He was insisting, in verse, that the way ordinary Scots actually spoke was worth preserving. That's the Macar's instinct, poetry as the record of a people, not just a poet's private feeling. And then he pointed that same fused instrument at his own present, not just the past. Burns was, by any honest reading, a political radical. He wrote in open support of the American Revolution in the 1780s, alarming friends who worried about his association with reform politics. In 1794, he wrote an ode marking George Washington's birthday, praising America for casting off imperial rule and pointedly suggesting that Scotland might learn something from it. And in 1795, drawing explicitly on Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, he wrote A Man's a Man for All That, the song that became his most enduring political statement, set fittingly to an older traditional tune. It's an anthem insisting that rank and title are worth nothing next to plain human honesty, imagining a day when ordinary people everywhere would stand as equals regardless of birth. I won't quote it at length. It deserves to be read in full rather than fragmented. But its argument is direct. A title is a stamp on a coin, not the metal underneath it. Burns wrote A Man's a Man in the same decade the American and French revolutions were redrawing what governments owed the people they governed. That's why I call him the culmination of the two traditions rather than just a great example of one. He took a bard's job, keeping the memory alive, and a macar's job, make it literature, and pointed the whole apparatus at the most urgent political question of his century. Scotland's national poet was also, quite consciously, one of its national radicals. That's where we're headed next. The philosophers of his own century asking the same question in prose instead of verse. But first, one more family story, since it turns out Burns has a way of showing up in unexpected corners of my own family tree, too. My ancestor, William Douglas, emigrated from Ayrshire to Loudoun County, Virginia around 1750, married Elizabeth Offutt, and named his new Virginia estate Garallan after the family seat back home. He brought the Douglas coat of arms with him and 6 silver spoons bearing the Douglas crest, carried along the ocean, across the ocean as physical proof of who he was. That original Garallan back in Ayrshire was owned by the Douglas family for generations, and Robert Burns himself was a friend of the household. A regular visitor there and nearly an employee. In 1786, the Laird of Garallan offered Burns a paying job overseas, which Burns seriously considered taking before his poetry unexpectedly made him famous enough to stay in Scotland instead. I like this connection less for the brush with fame and more for what my ancestor did with those spoons. He didn't just remember Garallan, he built a new one and put the family crest on the table. That's the habit of memory again, in silver instead of song. And a fitting place to leave Burns before we go ask a harder question about where else that habit might have led. I want to set the bards and macars down for a few minutes here. Not leave them behind, just set them aside while we follow a different thread that I think grows out of the same root. We'll pick them back up before long. I want to be careful with this next part because I'm about to suggest a connection I can't fully prove, and I'd rather say that honestly than dress it up as settled fact for a room that would rightly ask for the receipts. I don't know that anyone can draw a straight line from the ballad tradition to the Scottish Enlightenment, but I don't think it's a coincidence that a culture this obsessed with keeping its own memory alive, bards, macars, Jacobite song, all of it, also produced in the same century philosophers obsessed with a closely related question. What does a people owe itself, and what does it owe the government that claims to represent it? Let me give you the oldest data point first, because it's older than any of this by 400 years, and it's genuinely beautiful writing. In 1320, a group of Scottish nobles wrote a letter to the Pope that we now call the Declaration of Arbroath, arguing for Scotland's independence from England. Buried in it is one of the most quietly radical sentences in medieval political writing. The nobles told the Pope that they didn't follow Robert the Bruce because he was their rightful king by blood alone. They followed him because he defended their freedom, and if he ever stopped doing that, they would cast him out and choose another man who could. That's a 14th century document arguing that government rests on consent and forfeits its authority when it fails the people who granted it. Even in translation, it reads less like a legal filing and more like a bard's oath. Lyrical, plain-spoken defiance, not bureaucratic language. 400 years later, that same argument turns up again, dressed in the language of Enlightenment philosophy instead of medieval diplomacy. Let's start with Francis Hutcheson, born in Ulster to a Presbyterian family of Scottish descent, professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow from 1729. Adam Smith studied under him and called him the never to be forgotten Hutcheson. In 1725, in a work called An Inquiry into the Original of Our Ideas of Beauty and Virtue, Hutcheson wrote a sentence that would echo for the next 300 years, that the best action is the one that procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. That's decades before Bentham, and it's usually cited as the founding sentence of utilitarian ethics. But Hutcheson's real interest was government. He argued explicitly for a right of resistance against inadequate government, political authority held in trust, forfeited when it's abused. If that sounds familiar, it should. Whether Hutcheson's exact phrasing travels in a straight line to Jefferson's pursuit of happiness is genuinely contested among historians. Some trace that specific phrase more directly through the Scottish jurist Lord Combes and through George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, which Jefferson had open on his desk in the weeks before he drafted the Declaration. I'd rather give you the honest, debated version of this rather than a tidy myth that I can't defend, especially in a room like this one. Now, the line I find genuinely remarkable and much harder to dispute, John Witherspoon. Born in Scotland in 1723, an ordained Presbyterian minister who emigrated in 1768 to become the sixth president of the College of New Jersey, Princeton. He brought Scottish common sense philosophy into the classroom there and is the only member of the clergy among the signers of the Declaration of Independence. One of his students was a slight, studious 18-year-old from Virginia named James Madison, who arrived at Princeton in 1769, finished 2 years of coursework in one, and then stayed an extra 6 months after graduating, no requirement, just appetite, to keep studying privately with Witherspoon. Madison, of course, would later be called the father of the Constitution. And students who sat through Witherspoon's lectures recorded him teaching that good government must be complex, built so that one principle checks another, which is nearly word for word the architecture Madison built into the Constitution and defended in the Federalist Papers. So, when we ask where the framers got the idea that power should never rest undivided, that a good government has to be built to check itself on purpose, a meaningful part of that answer is a 14th century letter to a pope, refined 400 years later in a Scottish minister's classroom in New Jersey. I can't prove any of it exists because of a ballad tradition even older than Arbroath, but I can tell you that all of it came out of the same soil, a Presbyterian, literate, self-governing, story and argument-obsessed culture that never stopped asking what a people owes itself. Make of that correlation what you will. I find it hard to call it nothing. That's as far as I'll take the philosophy. Whatever thread runs from a 14th century letter to a New Jersey classroom, it was carried in the end by actual people getting on actual ships. Let's go back to them. They crossed the Atlantic in 3 different streams for 3 different reasons. You know this material as well as I do, maybe better, so I won't belabor it, but it's worth resetting the 3 streams clearly because everything else this morning leans on keeping them straight. Highland and Island Scots, Gaelic-speaking, clan-organized, came overwhelmingly after Culloden in 1746. As noted, the British government dismantled the clan system by law. Highland dress restricted, weapons confiscated, chiefs' authority broken. Layer rising rents from improving landlords on top of that, and emigration became both economic survival and a way for whole communities to stay together. Many of them came straight to the Cape Fear region of North Carolina. Entire Highland districts resettling together, so that Gaelic was genuinely a working language of the North Carolina sandhills for generations, surviving in some church services there until the early 20th century. I have a family stake in that particular migration too. My fifth great uncle was Gabriel Johnston, born in Scotland around 1698 and appointed royal governor of North Carolina in 1734, a post he held until his death in 1752. Johnston is often credited with personally starting Highland emigration to the Cape Fear, with having recruited the Argyll colony itself in 1739. I'd love to tell you that's true, and the timeline at least allows it. He'd already been governor for 5 years by then. But the honest version, the one careful North Carolina historians will tell you, is that this is a persistent family and regional tradition without documentary evidence behind it. What is solidly documented is that Johnston, a lowland Scot himself, spent his years in office after Culloden encouraging his fellow Scots to emigrate and helped secure them a 10-year tax exemption once they arrived. Real, provable encouragement of a wave of migration in his own lifetime, even if the founding myth version of his role in the earlier Argyll colony has gotten a little ahead of the paper trail. In In Edenton, a young immigrant named James Iredell studied law under Gabriel Johnston's nephew, Samuel Johnston, later a governor and U.S. Senator himself. Samuel's sister, Hannah, my fourth great-grandmother as it happens, married the young Iredell, himself of Ulster Scot descent through his mother's family. Iredell went on to help lead North Carolina toward independence and was later appointed by George Washington to the first United States Supreme Court. Lowland Scots left for different reasons entirely, not political collapse, but rapid economic modernization. Agricultural improvement consolidated small tenant farms. Merchants and tradesmen looked at the expanding British Atlantic economy and saw opportunity in ports like Charleston, Philadelphia, and Wilmington. And the Ulster Scots, originally lowlanders, many descended from the border reivers, planted in Ulster in the 1600s, partly to subdue the Irish and partly just to get a lawless border population out of Scotland. By the early 1700s, they were themselves squeezed. Rising rents, a linen industry that lurched between boom and bust, and legal penalties for being Presbyterians in a colony run by the Anglican establishment. Beginning around 1717, they left in numbers that dwarf the other two groups combined. Over 200,000 by the mid-1700s, landing mostly in Pennsylvania and moving south down the Great Wagon Road into the Shenandoah Valley and the Carolina backcountry. I've always found it a little ironic that the Highlanders ended up settling the Low Country, while the Ulster Scots, lowlanders by descent, ended up in the mountains. History does not organize itself for our convenience. By the eve of the Revolution, Scots from all three streams were thoroughly woven into colonial life, and every one of them, whichever stream they came from, brought the same habit of memory with them, which is where the story picks back up. Emigrants crossing the Atlantic in the 1700s carried almost nothing physical: a Bible, a few tools, if they were lucky, a fiddle. 6 to 10 weeks below deck, crowded, short on food and water, and for a meaningful number of passengers, a voyage they didn't survive. What traveled intact, weightless through all of that? Language, music, memory. I thought about that more than I expected on my own journey across the Atlantic from Scotland last month. 5 hours in a 787, mildly annoyed about the legroom, half watching a movie somewhere over the same water. 5 hours for an ocean that took my ancestors 6 to 10 weeks below deck, with no guarantee they'd survive the crossing at all. I don't think I'd ever really felt the size of that difference until I was sitting inside it, 5,000 feet up, complaining a little about the Wi-Fi. Let's go back to that original crossing for a second. Not mine, theirs. Here's the part I find genuinely remarkable about what they actually managed to carry with them. And it's not folklore dressed up as history. It's documented scholarship with a name and a date attached. In 1916, an English folk song collector named Cecil Sharp, working with his colleague Maud Carpellis, began 3 summers of field work in the southern Appalachians. He'd been told, skeptically, that there was no such thing as genuine American folk music worth collecting. Then he met a woman named Olive Dame Campbell, who showed him a portfolio of ballads gathered from mountain singers, ballads that were unmistakably old British and Scottish material, preserved in these hollows more completely than in the places they'd come from. By 1918, Sharp and Carpellis had collected some 1,600 songs from close to 300 singers. Ballads like Barbara Allen and Lord Randall turned up again and again, carried down the wagon road generations earlier and never written down until a stranger from England showed up asking. Sharp himself noted that the melodies he collected resembled the ballad traditions of the Scottish lowlands and northern England more than the Highlands, which tracks exactly with who actually made that migration. It wasn't Highland Gaelic song that seeded Appalachian music. It was Lowland and Ulster Scots ballad tradition carried by the people who settled the backcountry. Pardon me. Even the tunes shifted shape without losing their bones. Musicologists have long suspected the old Appalachian dance tune Cumberland Gap descends from a Scottish ballad called Bonnie George Campbell, a mournful song about a soldier's horse coming home riderless. Somewhere between a lowland farmhouse and a Tennessee hollow, that lament turned into a driving fiddle reel. The words changed. The story underneath it, loss, homecoming, a name worth remembering, didn't. The same families kept doing this in more than one form at once. Many of the singers who gave Cecil Sharp his ballads, the Hicks, Harmon, and Ward families of North Carolina, Western North Carolina in particular, were also the tradition bearers of what folklorists called the Jack Tales, trickster stories about a clever, none too scrupulous young hero outwitting giants and landlords and getting away with it. The character himself is old. English, Scottish, and Irish tale traditions all fed into him. And the same Ulster Scots settlers who carried ballads down the Great Wagon Road carried these stories alongside them, spoken rather than sung, doing exactly the same work, preserving a shared imagination across a forced separation from home. By the way, many of those jacktails were collected on Beech Mountain, where a number of us were staying a few days ago. It's a strange thing to know, walking around that the hollow you're standing in is the reason a stranger from England once had to revise his whole opinion of what America had preserved. It wasn't only entertainment carrying memory, worship did too. Scottish and Ulster Presbyterians brought a way of singing in church called lining out. A precentor sings a line of psalm unaccompanied, and the congregation sings it back, verse by verse. That practice was documented as surviving in the Cape Fear River Valley, right here in this region's own highland settlements, into the 1860s. Even church for these communities was partly an act of memory keeping set to music. You've probably noticed by now that I keep folding my own family into this story instead of only illustrating it with other people's. That's deliberate, not sentimental habit or bragging. The whole argument of this talk is that a culture's memory survives through exactly this kind of small, repeated, personal act. And it would be a little disingenuous of me to make that argument without practicing it myself. So, one more. My third great grandfather, John Williamson, left Lanarkshire for Wilmington in 1803. Near the end of his life, in 1840, he sat down and wrote a short account of that journey and ended it with one line: "This is a record of myself which may be of service to my family." He wasn't a poet and he wasn't a folklorist's subject. He was doing in plain prose exactly what the bards did in verse, exactly what Burns did in a song, and exactly what those Appalachian singers and storytellers were doing without knowing it had a name, making sure the story didn't die with him. It didn't. I'm holding it right now in this room 200 years later. All those ballads, tales, and psalms were how this community held on to who it had been. In 1776, it had to decide who it was going to become, and the choice split the community right down the middle, sometimes within the same family. I know this particular battle has been covered in this forum before by people considerably more qualified than me to walk you through it. But it has a hinge that the rest of this talk turns on, so it bears repeating, even to a room that already knows it. When the revolution began, the Highland Scots of the Cape Fear were in a genuinely difficult spot. Many had arrived recently, had sworn direct oaths of loyalty to the crown in exchange for their land grants, and had already lived through one failed rebellion against the British government back home. Scots take oaths seriously, so a significant number remained loyal, at least at first. In February of 1776, several hundred Highland loyalists, many still in traditional dress, many armed with broadswords rather than muskets, marched through the pine forests of southeastern North Carolina, commanded by Brigadier General Donald MacDonald, and headed to Wilmington to link up with the British troops arriving by sea. Illness kept MacDonald himself off the field that morning. Command of the actual charge fell to his second, Lieutenant Colonel Donald MacLeod, with Flora MacDonald's own husband Alan marching among the officers as a captain. Just before dawn, they reached a narrow wooden bridge over Moore's Creek. They expected to surprise a small Patriot militia. Instead, the Patriots had dismantled the bridge, greased the girders, and were waiting with muskets and cannon. And it's worth saying plainly that this wasn't simply Highlander against everyone else. There were Ulster Scots standing in that Patriot line too, on the opposite side from their Highland cousins before the sun even came up. The result effectively, I'm sorry, one moment. The result effectively ended royal authority in North Carolina and helped the colony become the first to instruct its delegates to vote for independence. The Halifax Resolves passed that April, first in freedom. I'll offer a supposition here, mine and other people's, not documented fact, that if that battle had gone the other way, if the Highland Loyalists had reached Wilmington and linked up with the British fleet as planned, it's very possible the Halifax Resolves never get written at all, or don't get written first. North Carolina's whole claim to being first in the nation to instruct its delegates toward independence may have come down to one bridge, one bad tactical decision, and one cold morning in February. Now, go 4 years later and 200 miles inland, and the story gets, if anything, more Scottish, not less. By the fall of 1780, British Major Patrick Ferguson, himself a Scot born in Aberdeenshire, was recruiting loyalist militia in the Carolina backcountry and threatening the frontier settlers who wouldn't join him. That threat backfired completely. Roughly 1,000 over-mountain men, settlers from the frontier of what's now Tennessee and southwestern Virginia, many of them Ulster Scots or their immediate descendants, mustered at Sycamore Shoals and set out after him. On October 7th, 1780, after a cold, rain-soaked overnight ride, roughly 900 of them surrounded Ferguson's camp on a wooded ridge called King's Mountain. The battle lasted a little over an hour. Ferguson, the only British regular on the field, was shot from his horse, one foot still caught in the stirrup, and his militia surrendered within minutes of his death. Thomas Jefferson later called Kings Mountain the turn of the tide of success in the Revolution. Personally, I still think it was Moore's Creek, but that's my opinion. Here's a detail I think this room in particular will appreciate. The Loyalist commander killed that day defending the crown was a Scot. The Patriot militia that killed him were led and largely filled by Ulster Scots, descendants of the same Reaver culture from the same corner of the British Isles, now on opposite sides of a mountain ridge in South Carolina. It's not just that Scottish communities in America split over the Revolution. At Kings Mountain, in a very literal sense, Scotland fought Scotland. History doesn't organize itself into tidy loyalties, and I think that complexity is more honest and more interesting than a story where everyone lines up on the correct side of history in hindsight. Everything so far has been about how this habit of memory got started and how it crossed an ocean. I want to spend the rest of our time on something just as important. It never stopped. And it's kept going because storytellers over the last 200 years kept reinventing what Scotland's own memory of itself looks like. One did it with a royal pageant. One did it with a biography that read like a novel. One is doing it right now with an actual novel. Let's take them in order. Go back to 1822. King George IV planned the first visit by a reigning monarch to Scotland in nearly 200 years, and the man Edinburgh handed the job of stage managing it was a novelist, Sir Walter Scott, the best-selling author in Europe at the time. In 3 frantic weeks, Scott built an entire royal pageant out of tartan. He put the king himself in a kilt of royal Stuart plaid, paired for reasons we will never fully understand with bright pink hose. He summoned Highland chiefs to Edinburgh in full regalia and told Lowland gentlemen that no one would be admitted to the state ball without Highland dress, which sent half of Edinburgh scrambling to invent a Highland grandfather overnight. Less than 80 years after the government had tried to legislate tartan out of existence, one storyteller's pageant turned it into the national costume of all of Scotland, Highland and Lowland alike. Just about every image you have in your head right now of what traditional Scottish dress looks like almost certainly runs back through that one event. Scotland didn't just write about Scotland. Scott didn't just write about Scotland. He invented a version of it that Scotland then adopted as its own memory. My own love of this history didn't start with a novel. It started in 8th grade when I read Antonia Fraser's biography, Mary Queen of Scots. It's a serious, well-researched work of history, not fiction. It won a major literary prize in 1969 when it came out. But critics described it at the time as reading like an engrossing novel, and that's exactly how it felt to me as a kid. I didn't experience it as homework. I experienced it as a story about a real person that happened to also be true. That's the book that made me fall in love with this whole subject decades before I ever picked up an Outlander novel. So when I bring up Diana Gabaldon in a moment, I don't want you to hear, here's a popular TV show that's good for tourism. I want you to hear, this is simply what Scotland's storytellers have always done to the rest of us. Scott did it with tartan in 1822. Fraser did it to an 8th grader with a rigorously footnoted biography in 1969. And Gabaldon is doing it right now to millions of people with a story that happens to run straight through the Cape Fear and into the backcountry spent so much time of our time today talking about. Gabaldon's Outlander books and the television series they inspired follow a World War II era nurse who travels back in time to 1740s Scotland and eventually to the Cape Fear and the backcountry of colonial North Carolina. Jamie and Claire Fraser's story runs through many of the exact same Highland communities we've been discussing this morning. Gabaldon isn't an historian either by training, and she isn't even Scottish. She's a storyteller who did meticulous research and then did what storytellers do. She put people and feeling into the historical record, and in doing that, she has introduced millions of readers and viewers, people who would never pick up a history of Scottish immigration, to precisely this story. I've seen the effect of that firsthand. This past February, the Scottish Society of Wilmington sponsored Gabaldon's travel to participate in the North Carolina First in Freedom Festival and the events at Moores Creek. We arranged several ticketed events, including a fact versus fiction walking tour of the battlefield. Those events sold out in less than 45 minutes and brought in over $45,000. This proves that Claire and Jamie's story is a door people can walk through to get to the actual history. That's the habit of memory doing exactly what it's always done over and over again for 200 years running. A bard kept a clan story alive by singing it. A Makar kept a king's reign alive by writing it. Robert Burns kept a failed rebellion alive by turning it into song. Walter Scott turned a suppressed style of dress into a national identity with one royal pageant. Antonia Fraser turned a 16th century queen into an eighth grader's obsession. And now, a novelist has kept an entire migration alive by turning it into fiction good enough that people will fly to North Carolina to stand where it happened. The technology changes. The instinct, tell the story so it survives, doesn't. The 250th anniversary of the commemoration of Moores Creek itself is worth dwelling on because it's not just an event about storytelling, it's an act of storytelling performed by hundreds of ordinary people who volunteered their time to do it. It was bigger than a single weekend. The North Carolina First in Freedom Festival ran a full week across 8 counties in southeastern North Carolina, each one hosting its own piece of the story. Colonial craft demonstrations, living history at Brunswick Town, talks on North Carolina's Black and Native patriots, and even a companion passport people could get stamped at each site, the same way you'd collect stamps at a national park. It's the kind of thing that only works if dozens of small local institutions all decide independently that the story is worth their time. It all built toward 3 days at Moores Creek itself. A day of education for school groups, a day of commemoration with a formal wreath-laying ceremony alongside the sons and daughters of the American Revolution, and a day of community celebration with music, games, food trucks, and living history all along the battlefield. One of the park's own staff, Matthew Woods, put the whole philosophy behind it better than I could. Every time we retell the story, he said, we keep those voices alive. Nothing of that happened by accident. It took months of planning by a great many people, most of whom will never get their name on anything, to make 3 days at a rural battlefield come together. And on the day of commemoration itself, more than 3,000 people showed up, in the cold, in the rain, on ground that turned to mud under their feet, which, if you think about it, is exactly right. February 27th, 1776 was cold and wet too. Nobody planned that symmetry. History just handed it to us. I want to tell you about one specific hour of that weekend because it's stayed with me since. I was sitting in my car near Moores Creek waiting to greet Gabaldon on her arrival, and I was passing the time reading her own description of the lead up to the battle, the fictional version, written years earlier of the very event I was about to commemorate. At one point, I looked up from the page and I realized I wasn't reading about that ground, I was sitting on it. 250 years later, to the day, I was reading a novelist's telling of the preparations for the battle to come, parked on the actual earth where it happened. I don't know a cleaner way to hand you the whole argument of this talk in one moment than that. Here's a number worth sitting with. A typical year at Moores Creek draws something like 75 reenactors. This year, for the 250th, more than 250 showed up. Highland Loyalists and Patriot militia both, in wool and linen, in that same February cold and rain, doing precise, repetitive, physically uncomfortable work so that a crowd of strangers could understand for a few minutes what that pre-dawn morning of 1776 actually felt like. I want to be direct about what I think those reenactors actually are, because I don't think we always give them the right credit. They're not just hobbyists in period costumes. They are, in the fullest sense of everything we've talked about this morning, the descendants of the bards and makars, using their bodies and weekends instead of a fiddle or a pen, doing the actual job of making sure a story that matters doesn't go quiet just because everyone who lived it is gone. That weekend, 17,500 people came out to watch them do it. That's the habit of memory, alive and well in 2026, and it took a full week, 8 counties, months of planning, and a great many bowls of Brunswick stew to pull it off. That same instinct is why organizations like this one, and like the one I help lead here in the Cape Fear, exist at all. There's a cairn that helps tell part of this story, standing on the riverbank at Brunswick Town. Near the site of the old docks, the same docks where those Highland ships first landed, stands the Cape Fear Scottish Immigration Memorial. The stones at the base of the cairn aren't decorative. They're actual ballast stones pulled out of the holds of the ships that carried those settlers across, and at least some of them, we know because they're marked, came from Scotland itself. So the memorial isn't just about the crossing. In a very literal sense, it's built out of the crossing. The memorial was erected by a dedicated group of people who worked with state and local officials and raised thousands of dollars based on nothing but an idea that the story of those Scots' journey is worth preserving. That's the habit of memory again, just built out of rock instead of a ballad. And it seems it isn't finished growing on its own either. There's been a small patch of thistle at Brunswick Town, unplanted, for years. Scotland's own national flower, growing wild on the ground where those Highland ships once landed. And by report, this year it's begun creeping slowly toward the cairn itself. I don't want to make more of that than it deserves, but I like a story where even the weeds seem to know which direction the memory is supposed to go. Now that the cairn is built, the Memorial Fund is turning its attention to the North Carolina Scottish Trek, being created to trace that same migration physically, a route modern visitors can actually take from the Highland Scots' arrival on the coast at Brunswick Town, inland through the Cape Fear settlements, all the way to the Ulster Scots backcountry in the mountains. Alongside the cairn and the trek, there's a third piece of this. Following the closure of St. Andrews, the Scottish Heritage Centre at St. Andrews University last year, we're developing the Scottish Heritage Discovery Centre as a place for research, education, and cultural programming. Building on a substantial existing collection of documents and artifacts from the Cape Fear and Sandhills region, The Discovery Center will be centered around the story of the Scottish diaspora in America. A meaningful part of what it will offer is genealogy resources, the kind of thing that led me to find John Williamson's own written account of his crossing. For a lot of visitors, what's preserved there won't just be history. It will turn out to be their own family's story, sitting in an archive, waiting for someone to come looking. The Discovery Center, like the cairn and the trek, is a monument too, just not the finished static kind. All three are, at bottom, an attempt to build a bigger, sturdier cairn for the same habit of memory we've been tracing all day. One stone, one record, one visitor at a time, so it doesn't depend on any single family's oral tradition surviving intact. It also shows up in ways that are a lot more fun than an archive or even a pile of rocks. Take a Burns supper. Every year around January 25th, communities that have never set foot in Scotland gather for a dinner built entirely around one poet. Bagpipes lead the haggis in on a platter. Someone recites the address to a haggis over it and cuts it open on cue, and the evening moves through toasts. One to Burns' memory, one to the lassies, one back from the lassies to the men, that are really just another form of the same thing we've been talking about all morning. Nobody at that dinner is reciting a history lecture. They're performing a piece of memory on schedule every single year so it doesn't lapse. Highland Games do the same work on a bigger scale. Clan tents line up so families can find their name in their tartan. Pipe bands compete. Dancers compete. And then there's the caber toss. Watching someone hoist what is essentially a telephone pole and heave it end over end is one of those things that needs no historical footnote to land it. It just works. The Port City Highland Games here in Wilmington, the Grandfather Mountain Games, and all the others around the world draw people whose first real connection to Scotland is standing in a field, watching a stranger throw a log, and for a lot of them, that's the moment the rest of this history stops being abstract. I'll say, as someone who's helped organize a fair number of these events through the Scottish Society of Wilmington, none of this runs itself. Somebody books the field, feeds the pipe band, orders the haggis, prints the programs. Every Burns supper and every Highland Games is, underneath the fun, a small logistics operation dedicated entirely to making sure a 500-year-old habit doesn't skip a year on our watch. And sometimes the memory shows up as something closer to temperament than tradition. There's been a habit in Glasgow since the 1980s of topping public statues with a traffic cone. It started with the Duke of Wellington statue outside the Gallery of Modern Art and never really stopped. It's irreverent, a little defiant, and completely unbothered by the dignity of the monument in question. That is, in miniature, the same cultural DNA that produced the Border Reivers and the Ulster Scots' allergy to distant authority. The accent changes, the temperament doesn't. And you'll see in a moment, neither does the habit of putting a cone on things wherever in the world a Scot happens to be standing. This June, Scotland qualified for the first World Cup in nearly 30 years. And the Tartan Army, the name Scotland's traveling supporters have earned over decades, followed them across the Atlantic in numbers that generally surprised the host cities. I saw part of that migration myself as it happens. I was in the Edinburgh airport last month, and I've never in my life seen that many in kilts in one place other than Grandfather Mountain. Every single one of them was headed to Boston. The whole terminal was electric with it. Not just nerves, pure hope and enthusiasm, the kind you can't fake and really can't describe unless you've stood in the middle of it. Scotland's group stage matches were played at Boston Stadium in Foxborough, and thousands of kilted, bagpipe-playing fans took over the city in between. They gathered at a statue of Robert Burns in the Back Bay Fens, the same poet who spent this whole talk being the culmination of two traditions at once, and marched from there to Fenway Park playing Flower of Scotland. A downtown brewery reportedly poured through roughly 70 kegs of beer in a 4 day stretch. The Boston Globe ran a full-page thank you to the visiting supporters. And Boston's mayor signed a sister city twinning agreement with Glasgow in the middle of the tournament inside a pub packed with celebrating fans. And naturally, that Glasgow tradition I mentioned made the trip too. Scottish fans topped every statue they could find with a traffic cone during the tournament, the exact same gesture 4,000 miles from Glasgow. From Boston, the Tartan Army moved on to Miami for Scotland's match against Brazil, marching through Little Havana, filling a ballpark with bagpipes. No Scotland, no party became something close to an official chant. I want you to sit with the symmetry of that for a second. In 1651, Daniel Forbes crossed the Atlantic Ocean in chains, a prisoner with nothing of his own and no say in the matter, and landed in Massachusetts. 375 years later, I watched thousands of his countrymen cross it again, by choice, in kilts, with bagpipes, to fill the streets of that very state, cheerfully and unmistakably Scottish, in a city that welcomed them with open arms. Some of them, for all I know, share an ancestor with me too. Not through Daniel directly, but further back, through whichever brothers, sisters, and cousins of his never left Scotland at all. My branch of the family crossed and survived. Theirs stayed home and survived. This summer, both branches ended up standing on the very same shore. The most important thing the Scottish immigrants brought to America wasn't a tartan, a broadsword, or even a political philosophy. It was a habit of memory, a belief that stories matter, that ancestors matter, that communities survive when their stories are told. Cheery and Drozda for now. Farewell, and thank you for listening to my stories. Any questions?
Outstanding.
Thank you.
Outstanding. I am so moved. We'd like to open the floor for comments and questions for Catherine after this excellent presentation.
You couldn't see me clapping.
Don't be shy, folks.
Turn
Not
on,
allowing me to open my video.
turn on the cameras.
I would say, as my family's, I suppose, unofficial historian with documented roots back to the Ulster Scots and the Reivers, and then to the Covenanters. This talk was just exceptional. It really struck a chord. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ditto, ditto.
It was a little intimidating to present to this group, but I hope I did well.
That was an incredible and rewarding presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It wasn't exactly perhaps what you were expecting, but Connie had asked me to touch on a few things, so I tried to work everything in.
Well, you did a superlative job. The Zoom folks have changed their technological features, and I'm having trouble getting everybody unmuted and turning it back on. So please feel free.
You can't do that, Connie. Everybody has to do that individually.
Okay.
Okay.
And for anybody who's interested, just to bring the genealogy full circle. So Daniel Forbes' great-granddaughter married James and Hannah Iredale's grandson. And that's how the Forbes and Iredale families crossed. And that's where I came from.
I have a question for you, Catherine, or some of the other North Carolinians that are on the Zoom today. I had just a very inspirational opportunity to visit Alan and Flora McDonald's farm, uh, buried in the hinterland in North Carolina, and really it was almost intimidating to hike up through the woods to get up where they were in that isolated area. I'm just wondering, as you plan, and forgive me, the roots of the
The
immigrants from
trek.
North
Yeah.
Carolina, the trek. Um, do you plan to make some of these amazing sites in North Carolina more approachable and accessible to visitors?
We don't have any plans to do that. We will be putting plaques on things, and we'll have an interactive story map that people can follow online. But there's at this point no plan to actually invest in preserving these places. That's not the job of
That
the
can be
trek.
phase three.
Right. Yes.
Jim, were you trying to join in there? Did I hear you, or Randy?
Hey, I was trying. Is my mic working?
Yes, Jim.
Okay. By the way, this is interesting. I tried to click on my camera one more time, and when I do, a sign appears on my screen, meeting alert. You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So I said, okay, you know, anyway, I'm going to the Geek Squad.
Anyway.
Uh,
Okay.
I'm getting a message that says the host stopped my video too.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
We all are.
Okay, since I'm the
Well,
host,
some of us were able to unclick it without a problem. So
Right.
good old Zoom.
Yeah.
hi,
Yeah.
John. Usually, if you don't have your camera turned off when the speaker is speaking, I go through and turn them off. But today, they're not turning back on. I don't know. I'm great.
Oh.
Okay, Jim, I just got yours to come back on, and I apologize.
Okay.
I was telling Jack Sanders, Catherine and I had a heck of a time having a test Zoom this
Okay.
week because of the changing technology. And
Yeah.
Jack Sanders, our technological whiz, I was trying to plead my case by saying, Jack, I've been doing this for 14 years. But they do keep changing the technology. I'm
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
I wanted to speak. You were talking about the immigration trail,
Yes.
and and I want to take the occasion to say, great, who, cheers for the Scottish Society of Wilmington for taking the lead and really running with that, and it has been a thing that everybody has gathered around and contributed to help and will continue. But to make some of those places more approachable would require, I'm not sure how to build roads and Catherine, don't laugh, in some really strange places that you can't get there unless you're going there.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about the Gilchrist house, number one. That's just a spot, right?
Right. Right.
And but all across the Carolinas are spots that really are I think will be will be marked and plaqued or ever how we do it. But St. Andrews is really honored to have been a part of trying to support uh, Wilmington as much as they possibly could, and all we could do was money. But,
Right.
but
And
and what a marvelous spot! And the corn. After all the tribulations and trials, Catherine, tell the story where those stones were found and how how it became a cairn rather than the initial plan. That's if
Well,
we could.
we had, just briefly, we had originally planned, and Bob McLeod's on this call too, so I should
Yep,
probably
yep, yep, yep.
let him talk about this. We originally had planned to do a smaller cairn on the Wilmington Riverwalk, and we had just about after years of working, we had just about gotten the city to sign off on it when they decided no more public memorials on private land. I mean, sorry, other way around, private memorials on public land. And so just about that time, Jim McKee at Brunswick Town said, well, it really ought to be here. This is where they actually landed. So we pivoted, and it took us about 7 years to get the whole process from start to finish. And kudos to Bob and that early team, because they raised what was it, Bob? $30,000 without even anything other than an architectural drawing and an idea.
Well, that was it, Catherine. Actually, we were trying to sell a product that did not exist. We were selling an idea, a concept. We asked people to have faith in us, that we want to do this. This is something important. The Scots are so important to the settlement of North Carolina, yet very few people that live here have any idea. So our idea was to start with this cairn at Brunswick Town, where up to 20,000 Highland Scots arrived, starting with the Argyll colony in 1739, and then going throughout the state and pointing out different places. And you mentioned places you can visit. Oh, yeah, that's what we want to do virtually. So we've gone to places such as the South River Presbyterian Church in Bladen County, North Carolina, which was founded around 1750 by a Gaelic-speaking congregation. No longer an active church, but has been preserved by some of the previous parishioners, and they have an annual homecoming. So we've made a nice presentation at their homecoming. They have a nice plaque there now. The Mill Prong House, which is very close to where Dame Flora, where her farm was in Red Springs, North Carolina, we presented one there. Just in May, three of us traveled to the western part of North Carolina and visited three or four, actually, of the very old Presbyterian churches and graveyards that were settled by the Ulster Scots, or as they refer to themselves there, the Scots-Irish, back before the American Revolution. And we'll be, I'm laughing because Catherine hates that term because it's not proper, but try to tell the Scots-Irish it's not proper. But anyway, we're presenting the same thing there. And the whole idea is we will have a professionally made website that when you pull it up, you'll see the state of North and South Carolina with pins. And you can touch any of those pins. And in the case of the, say, the South River Presbyterian Church, a picture will come up of the church, interior of the church. Somebody will give you a narration of the history of the church, take you for a tour through the graveyard, and then if you want to see documentation, it's listed on the Register of Historic Places. You can read that documentation. So virtually, you will be able to go through the state of North Carolina, South Carolina, and look at all of these places that were so important in the development of North Carolina. And of course, as Catherine talked about, the Scottish Heritage center that's being built in probably in Pinehurst, Southern Pines, that area. That'll be a physical place that'll display a lot of these artifacts. So you can have the physical artifacts, the family Bibles, the pottery that was brought over, that type thing. And virtually you can visit all of these places throughout the state. So that is our intent.
Yeah.
But the Karen,
Yeah.
that was again quite a project. Even though it took us about 7 years to raise the funds through individuals, through organizations such as the North Carolina St. Andrews Society, the Dunvegan Foundation, several of the clan and family societies, a lot of individuals. But at the same time, we were also lobbying the state of North Carolina that this is on public land. It's a public historic site. And just getting through the politics, even though it cost the state nothing, it took us all that time to get their approval to actually do it. And so that part is a done deal. That's the beginning of the trek. So now we need help as we continue.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've put a link to the website for that and for the Scottish Heritage Discovery Center in the chat.
Okay.
And Bill Caudle's not on the call today. He's judging a piping contest today. So just a little bit about the Scottish Heritage Discovery Center, a little more about that. And it's sort of too is like the cairn. It's a concept, and we're asking for money to make it a reality. It's likely going to be in Pinehurst. And we are in the middle of a feasibility study to determine whether this is actually doable, but we think it is, and we're looking forward to moving forward with that when the feasibility study is done in October.
And we'll want to be hearing more about that. So
Yeah.
we'll be in touch and looking forward to future
Yes.
updates on at the forum.
Yeah. Yeah. For those of you who were at Grandfather Mountain, Bill had an exhibit case that we've had constructed with some of the artifacts from the collection in it, and that was very well received.
So all of the archives and artifacts and so forth were preserved.
Yes, they are safely in climate controlled storage and secure. Yeah. And we're very grateful that Scottish Heritage USA stepped up and said, we will take, because the university required that they have some place to go. And SHUSA stepped up and said, we will take this on as a project. And therefore you can release those the documents and all of the artifacts to us. So,
just out of curiosity, was the university or the college closed just due to lack of enrollment, or what were the drivers there?
It was, well, a number of years ago, St. Andrews was bought by a for-profit university system. They seemed to have made a decision that instead of doing liberal arts and equestrian, it should be a sports college. Which really didn't go over very well in Laurinburg, North Carolina. And also they had some serious damage done to a number of their buildings during Hurricane Florence that they didn't have the funds to repair. So like the student union building was closed and the science labs and things like that. It was economically no longer viable for that for-profit institution to run it. And they gave Bill 2 weeks notice that they would be closing as of graduation. And he had 2 additional weeks to get everything out of the building.
For those of you who may be less familiar, St. Andrews was originally a merger of 2 North Carolina colleges, one of which was the Flora McDonald.
Yes.
Was that the correct name?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
such a history there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, you'll do bigger and better things, so stay tuned.
That's the plan. We'll make it, the Scottish Heritage Center was kind of North Carolina focused. And this we intend for it to be a national, more of a national destination.
Marvelous.
Yep.
Question.
Yeah.
Bob, do I remember that I've forgotten the name, but the state historical fellow's name over at
Jim McKee. Jim McKee.
Didn't some of the stones in the cairn were they ballast stones or
Yes,
ballast stones?
yes, they were, Jim. The cairn itself is made of, I guess we call it architectural stone. I mean, flat stones. But around the base, those are actual ballast stones that were offloaded off these ships. When the ships would come over carrying passengers, very lightweight, and so they had to have a lot of ballast to hold them down. Once they got here, the passengers were unloaded, then the stones were taken out, and the ships were reloaded with barrels of pitch, tar, turpentine, what they call naval stores, which were very heavy, obviously, which something that the British Navy needed to keep their ships from leaking. But the stones then would, since they're in the coast of North Carolina, there's no rocks. If you find a rock, it came from somewhere else. I mean, this is sand here. So these ballast stones were used to pave some of the streets and also for foundations of the colonial town of Brunswick. We do know who lived in what houses, and these stones, a lot of them came from a house that was occupied by a Gaelic speaker official. He was kind of the translator. These of course, these people that came over from the Highlands, most of them couldn't speak English at all. They were Gaelic speakers. So this gentleman, he was the king's representative there and worked with these people. And these stones came from the foundation of his house. So we know that connection back to Scotland. But yes, the ones all around the base, those are definitely ballast stones that came from Scotland or England. So it's really, if any of you plan to visit North Carolina, it is really a must-see place. It's just the other thing about the Brunswick town, and this was just pure luck, is right next to it is the Sunny Point Military Ocean Terminal. Almost all of the ammunition, explosives for the military leaving the United States goes through that terminal. As a result, they have a large, what they call a buffer zone, just in case they have a oops over there. They can't build anything around it. And across the river is also part of the buffer zone, and also the Carolina Beach State Park, which has no buildings. So if you walk down to the riverfront and you look out over the Cape Fear River, you are seeing exactly what they saw in the 1700s. There's no building in sight. The only man-made object you'll see out there is a buoy in the shipping channel. But that's it. You're going to see exactly what they saw. So to me, it's just moving to be there and just understand that, hey, these people, this is the first step in America, on this continent. A lot of immigrants into the Carolinas would have come up Charleston or come down from Virginia, but this is the only group of people that came directly to North Carolina, and this is where they landed, up to 20,000 of them over several decades.
A source of North Carolina pride.
Old story.
Yeah. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention that we sell paving stones. Commemorative paving stones.
Yes.
I'd like to interrupt. I don't know if you can see this. It's a glass box.
Yeah.
I keep on my coffee table in sort of my library in there. And I collected, I'll use the word collected, a ballast stone from Flora and Alan McDonald's farm. There's a creek. And this is treasure. If you talk to me nicely, I may give it back to you for yourself.
There are actually piles of these ballast stones back in the woods at Brunswick Town. So we were able to just, Jim was kind enough to let us go and forage for those in the woods. Not something that you want to do, by the way, on your own, because there are things that will kill you in those woods. And if you wander too far, you will be met with people with shotguns and machine guns.
My land.
Yes.
Scottish descendants, yes.
Yes. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this for this august bunch of people. I really enjoy these forums every month, and I've learned a lot from everyone who's presented here, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to share.
Thank you.
Well
Thank
done,
you so much.
Catherine. Well done. We'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting now. I really applaud all of you who have joined today to hear this magnificent presentation. And I do hope you'll join in every month, each and every one of you. All of the presentations are outstanding. I never cease to be amazed. They're excellent. So please join in and let's keep our Scottish heritage and culture alive. Thank you and be safe.
Okay. Connie, would you send me a link to the recording when you have it?
I certainly will. We can probably even
Thanks.
send you a copy.
Okay.
Thank you, dear. Thank you so much.
All right. See everyone next month.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your good work.
Thank you.